So we'll now get into our session this morning, BWC 101, Building a Foundation for Your Body-Worn Camera Initiative. Joining us for this session is David Lewis, the BJA Body-Worn Camera Lead and Senior Policy Advisor. We'll also be joined by Dr. Michael White, who is our Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance Co-Director and a professor at Arizona State University. This session will go over BJA's Body-Worn Camera Policy and Implementation Program, including an overview of the grant program. We'll talk in brief about what the research tells us about body-worn cameras and their utility. We'll also talk about how to inform policy and practice through the Body-Worn Camera Policy and Implementation Program, and touch briefly on training and technical assistance available to you. With that, I'd like to pass it off to David Lewis to begin his portion of the presentation. Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. Carrie mentioned my name is David Lewis. I'm with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and over this last year, I've been lucky enough to work on the body-worn camera program, filling in for a coworker, John Markovic, that's had this program for several years, who's currently being detailed over to the Law Enforcement Commission. This is a great program. I've been lucky enough to, like I said, be involved with it this year. But this was technology that really wasn't available when I was a police officer. It seems to be back in the day. But the technology is amazing. One of the things that we did as we developed this program was develop this body-worn camera toolkit. And the body-worn camera toolkit is really there to assist our new grantees, our senior grantees, on things they need to help with their programs, provide resources that they might need, provide guidance, possible policies, procedures, those kind of things, and help identify them. And not only that, to help identify other grantees that they might be able to do kind of a peer-to-peer exchange. Now, I will tell you that the body-worn camera toolkit is getting a bit of a facelift right now. It's currently being added to the actual OJP BJA website. And when we do the resources section, we'll be able to, we're going to share the new URL. The old one will still work, but you'll get that new facelift of body-worn camera. Is it really going to change the look? No. But what we want to do is make sure that information that we have is available to you as the grantees, and for those that are interested in becoming grantees, that you have the most up-to-date information. You have the links to documents that are being created for this particular program. And we all know as we move into this technical world, as what's brought COVID-19 brought onto us, and actually forcing us to do this as a virtual conference, there's nothing that's more frustrating than to go to a website, hit on a link, and not be able to bring that information up. So that's what we're trying to address, and I'm lucky enough, and I'll talk a little bit more about our Training and Technical Assistance Advisor here shortly. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that under this particular program that we have some very clear objectives and deliverables. And obviously the very first one is the purchase and implementation of body-worn cameras. Now, there are some very specific guidelines, especially when, as you all know, as grantees, but if we have people that may be listening in thinking about being grantees or expanding their particular program, the one thing that you always have to be aware of is that when you're out there seeking your body-worn cameras, that it's competitive, it's fair, it follows all the right guidelines set up by the procurement, not only for the federal government, but also for your state, and maybe a county, and might even be a city. But the one thing that when we look at this is that you need to know, and you guys are dealing with this, is that this is a 50% match program, in that you can get X number of dollars from the federal government, but then you have to provide a $1 match as part of the program. Now, why bring this up here? Because a majority of our attendees are already grant recipients. Is that maintaining that as things change, we find programs that may want to change how they're doing the match, and all that's very important. And you're going to get an opportunity to meet the people from BGA that will help you with those things. The next one, that item number 2, is the development and planned and phased approach. As you take on this, and many of you are learning as your new grantees, and we have some of our older grantees on here, that as you take on this endeavor, that you have to take a look at, what policies need to be in place, what training, how are they going to be deployed, who are they going to be deployed at. Yesterday, our keynote speaker, Chief Ramsey, talked about not originally deploying them to their SWAT team. So we have seen now that as we look at some of these plans that are being submitted, that they're not only providing the cameras to sworn law enforcement, but also some support law enforcement, for example, animal control and some of the other ones. So it's very important to look at all these items and have that in your policies, procedures, and have that documentation. And that's one of the reasons, and we talk more about it when we talk about our TTA provider, that we have a lot of restrictions on this, and we don't want you kind of just doing this on your own, but how can we provide the best support for you to help make these accomplishments. Now, item number 3 is the implementation of operational procedures and tracking mechanisms. So when you deploy this particular program, you're going to have a lot of things that you have to deal with. And as we know, as things changing in this times with police reform, some of the executive orders even coming from the government, talk about body-worn cameras with federal task forces. So there's a lot of different things that you have to take into consideration when you do the implementation. So not only how they're going to be used, but how do you review this information? How do you access it? Where is it going to be stored? What's the retention and redaction periods? And most of all, if you have to delete information, what the requirements are. Next slide, please. Now, when we talk about this item number 4, the demonstration of commitment to incorporating of the evidentiary value of body-worn cameras. Now, when dealing with this digital evidence, it's extremely important that not only the administrators are well-versed on, how we're going to deal with this and showing the commitment, but also the field operations people, all the others involved, including how does this improve the way the officers do their job, and not only that, citizen safety. But also one thing that we need to mention, that not only are we talking about improvements in officers' performance, maybe, or how the officers conduct themselves in the field and citizen safety, we're also looking at officer safety. Because when you look at these things, and they may be used for training in the future on how to actually show officers in particular situations what's the best way to react, come up with ways, and actually provide that type of training. Now that kind of is a good segue into number 5, which is establishing training protocols. And one of the things that was important, and if you were on the session today with the sub-grantees from the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, these chiefs and supervisors talked about what training is necessary out there. And not right away because of the deployment, people think for the officers, but also we have to think about the supervisors, especially the mid-level supervisors, because they're the ones that are going to have that direct contact with the officers. They're the ones that are going to most likely looking at those footages, and obviously the administrators, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable for use and policy. So that brings us to item number 6. Addressing access to and sharing of body-worn camera footage. Now, there is a lot of different people now that they know that these things are out there, and it's not limited. And yesterday when they talked about some views from the field, they were not only talking about what they had to implement with reviewing body-worn camera footage, but also if they had community cameras, in-car cameras. So all of this comes together. And especially there are programs out there that interface not only the body-worn camera but the in-car cameras. So, it's important that the agency personnel, what are they required to do? But obviously, when you're dealing with a case and something that you're ready for the prosecution, that the prosecutors have access to that information. And one of the things that when you're talking about sharing this information is good working relationship, not only with the department who is capturing that video, but the prosecutors that are make that decision on what should be released, what shouldn't be released, how it may affect the case. So all those things need to be taken into consideration. Now, there are mention about other criminal justice stakeholders, and I mentioned briefly about federal task forces. There's actually a study that's been going on right now with the Department of Justice and evaluating this information. And what do you do if just a general community leader or individual comes and says, I'd like to see this information? On the previous workshop, one of the chiefs, I believe the chief of Mount Lebanon, provided a situation where somebody wanted to come in and see that particular piece of footage. And what they did was they offered to have them come in, and to date, they hadn't come in to see it. So those kind of things on who has that access, how it's going to be shared, what the methodologies is all important. Now, finally, number 7, it talks to us about the implementation of the appropriate body-worn camera policies. Now, this comes into, obviously, the number one thing and what we do here, because you do have very specific requirements, as you know, with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, that you have to have certain policies in place before you can even have access to your funding. 90% of your funding is held until your body-worn camera policy is approved. And that's, again, why our training and technical assistance advisors are there to help you and work you through those. But you must also take into consideration, are there any restrictions maybe in a county or local ordinances? Are there state laws that have certain oversight on this type of information, how it's shared and so forth? But not only that, protecting the privacy rights of the individuals. Now, they may be victims, they may be other individuals that are involved in the particular case. There are certain cases, for example, maybe domestic violence cases or other things where victims are. And the other thing on what type of information is captured, the Chief Ramsey talked about in certain situations that the video information is too informative or over the top, as you might say. But also this last one point that talks here about the release of the video to the public. And situations have arisen, and that's why I talk about the importance of having that relationship with your prosecutor so you both are on the same page when it comes to releasing that particular information. Now, next slide, please. Just to kind of give you a little brief history and the evolution of this particular program. The body-worn camera program was developed in May of 2015, and the Bureau of Justice Assistance has made funding available from 2015 to 2019. And we also have funding. There was funding in 2020. The one thing I will tell you right now as we look at the next generation, I'll talk about this in some of these slides coming up, that the slides do not depict some of the funds that we're using for 2020. But 2021, we're still kind of in a holding pattern, whether this with information or grants may be available. But we believe strongly, especially with the reform information coming out from the White House, from Congress, that body-worn cameras is playing a very, very intricate role in dealing with use of force, officers, relationships with the community. So we look for that to continue. Now, all of these, there is a grant program here at the Bureau of Justice Assistance. We talked a little bit about the body-worn camera toolkit, but it is a competitive program. We do not, in some of the awards, for some of the awards that you may have gotten through the Bureau of Justice Assistance, that we do some continuations or supplements, we call them, but each year it's a competitive grant. So even if grantees, you get a grant, let's say you got a grant in 2019 and you were looking for funding for 2020, you would need to come back in and reapply. Now, the one thing that that we have to kind of clarify here, that it cannot be, I'm just applying to continue to pay my contracts. That's not what this program is designed to do. It's very specifically, as you'll see on the slides, it's for new programs, pilot programs, and for expansion of body-worn camera programs. For example, we see a lot of larger departments and state agencies that may have 1,000 officers. Well, they came in and the first year did a pilot program and say they got 250 cameras. Well, would they come back to us and they say, well, we'd like to expand their program and get another 250, maybe even 600 cameras. But that's the one thing that, that's the one caveat on this, is it has to follow in one of these caveats here. Now, we also have had, and I'll talk a little bit, and you'll get a little more information on this in upcoming slides, but Training and Technical Assistance Award. We were allowed to take some of the funds that were allotted to us from Congress that would allow us to identify a training and technical assistance provider. And what that individual organization does is they assist with the items for you as the grantees need help with, whether it's training, whether it's help with your policy, whether it's some technical assistance, whether it's providing some peer-to-peer discussion or ability for you to find other departments of similar size that may be helpful for you in developing your particular policies. Next slide, please. Now, just to kind of build a little bit more on this training and technical assistance, and we like to call it TTA. The solicitations, we put them out in 2015, 2019, but this is called a cooperative agreement, and what you all have are actually grants from us. The cooperative agreements allows us to work hand in hand with the selected TA providers. And the unique part about this, and this is an important bullet I wanted to point out on here, that this TTA provider not only provides support to our grantees, but also for non-grantees and individual agencies that's saying, hey, I'm interested in starting a body-worn camera program. What are my steps? Where do I go? How do I do these things? So that's extremely, extremely important in developing and expanding the body-worn camera program. One of the things in this bullet talks about this national community of practice. You heard Acting Director Costigan talk about the number of agencies, 420 that were reviewed, policy reviewed, and those. That's all important. And we at the Bureau of Justice Assistance were part of the Department of Justice, obviously, under the Office of Justice Programs. But we are doing, what we do here at BJA is mostly the grant monitoring, issuing awards, and helping get you through and providing your programs. Now, our sister agency at the National Institute of Justice, they have worked with us and worked with our TA provider in providing this research, getting more information. You know, are body-worn cameras valuable? Do they assist with communities? How do officers use them properly? So it's not only do we have this, building this community of practice, but also this research on. Next slide, please. Now, this is just a quick summary, and I'll just go over this quickly. Just to look at, and I mentioned that this started in 2015, and you'll see it's been, on an average, we're looking somewhere between 80 or so funded awards every year. That we're at this total now of 421 awards, and it's $82+ million. I just wanted to add that there was a 2020 awards program. Now it's a little unique. We only funded 40 awards in 2020. Now, the uniqueness of it, we also allocated specifically $10 million to help go out there and identify agencies that are smaller, rural, and tribal agencies that may not have that ability to do the full grant process, but we're created a micro grant program to assist these smaller rural agencies. Now, I would say is if any of you have agencies that are adjacent to you, or maybe there's some potential grantees online, if you're this smaller rural type agency, usually populations of under 100,000, I would recommend that you reach out to the Bureau of Justice Assistance. What we're doing is we're identifying a particular TTA provider that will specifically work with agencies of this size to help get them funding to begin to institute and implement a body-worn camera program. Next slide, please. Now, this is kind of an interesting slide here. If you look at, you think that the body-worn camera is all police and sheriff's departments. But what we did, we take a look at these numbers, and we see some very unique numbers here that, there are universities and college police departments, county PDs, in certain states, the county, there may be a sheriff's office and a county police department, obviously state police and tribal agencies. But some of them are, we haven't had any recent ones, but some regional police departments. We've had one school-based police department come in, or three that we came in. But also I want to mention about the state administrating agency. For those of you that might have been lucky enough to listen to the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, state administrating agencies are agencies that are related to their state organizations that get direct funding from the Bureau of Justice Assistance to help agencies within their states. But we also allowed these SAAs to come in and apply for money that instead of having the smaller police departments come in and do full applications, the SAA would get the funding and then provide funds in kind of a sub-award program. This correctional agencies, as you'll see, this is really came up in 2018 that that we saw this increase that went from just 1 in 2017 to 5 in 2019. We're getting a lot more individuals asking about body-worn cameras in the correctional facilities. And a lot of this has to do and works in conjunction with sheriff's departments. But the one thing that about this program is that the cameras need to go to law enforcement agencies. So they have to identify themselves as a law enforcement agency. Now, regional consortia, that's where you might have a series of police agencies go together and come in for one funding, which is more than acceptable. I think in 2020 that we're going to see one more of those. We're going to see another correctional facilities come in. So that's going to continue to grow. Next slide, please. Now, this is kind of a unique slide also, and why I want to bring it to your attention. You'll see on the left its number of awards, and the award total is on the right. And you'd say, well, shouldn't those things go together? Shouldn't they be the exact same? In other words, I got this many awards, I got this amount of money. Well, the reason that is not the same is that one award, they vary. For example, in 2020, the maximum number of funding was $2 million in 2020, and it has been that way in previous years. But you have agencies coming in that may just ask for $50,000 or may ask for $25,000. So we could perceivably provide more grants at a lower dollar amount and then have less grants at higher dollar amount to kind of offsets these numbers. But as you can see that there's a lot of funding that's gone out to the states, and you see California and Florida kind of going back and forth at the top level there. Next slide, please. This map basically shows kind of a distribution. And if you look in the lower left-hand corner, that gives you kind of a legend on what the breakdowns are. And again, it shows you the numbers. In 2015, we had 73. 2016 was our highest. And that year, we did a lot of some of the lower amounts were requested that particular, so there was more grants provided. So if you look at here, and you'll see there's a little bit of a gap kind of in our central states, and we're looking to address those. And one of the reasons that we see this little bit of a disproportionate is a lot of these are smaller rural agencies, especially the agencies we see down on the southwest border, New Mexico, Arizona. So you'll see that the far Pacific coast has the highest number there. But obviously, when you look at the East Coast and Middle America, the mid East there, there's a lot there. We do have some, if you look all the way to the far bottom right, we do have some agencies that do have body-worn cameras in Puerto Rico. So next slide, please. This is my contact information. I urge you, if you have to copy this, if you have any questions about the body-worn camera program, if you are having any issues possibly with your grant or things that need to be addressed, our body-worn camera team here at the Bureau of Justice Assistance work extremely close together, and I look forward to talking with you, answering questions whenever I can. And I thank you for taking your time to listen to my portion of this. And please go out there, be safe, and remember, BJ is here to help you whatever way we can. At this time, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mike White, for the next portion of this session. Thank you.
All right, thanks, David. So what I wanted to do for the next 15 minutes or so is talk a little bit about resources, and then hit on what we call some of the foundations of the TTA program. Next slide, please. David mentioned the National Body-Worn Camera Toolkit, and hopefully you've had the opportunity to take a look at the toolkit. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a history on its development. I think it was in December of 2014, the president gave a speech at the White House and made that initial pledge of $75 million for up to 50,000 body-worn cameras. And this TTA, or this funding program that you're part of, is really the realization of that initial pledge. And as you can see, a few months after that initial pledge from the White House, BJA held what they called an expert panel. And it was a 2-day session. It was moderated by myself and a colleague of mine from ASU, Chuck Katz. And essentially what they did is they locked about 100 or so really smart people in a room for 2 days and had a giant brainstorming session about body-worn cameras. And our objective then, after the session, over the next several months, Dr. Katz, myself, and several others, was to build the content for the toolkit based on all the wisdom from that expert panel. And as you can see, there's the link. It went live in May of 15, and as David said, it's undergoing a bit of a facelift. But the idea here is that the toolkit is an information warehouse. It's the place you should go to learn the latest and greatest about this technology. It doesn't matter if you're a chief of police, a line officer, a concerned citizen, a civil rights attorney. It's a place where you can go to learn about body-worn cameras. So hopefully that's one resource that you've taken advantage of. Next slide, please. The other resource I wanted to mention is us, the TTA team, CNA, ASU, Justice and Security Strategies. David talked about us. Think of us as a support system. We're here to make sure that you are successful with your grant. And we've been at this for a while now, so this is our 5th year. The next slide will have our website, but we engage in a wide range of activities to help you be successful: podcasts, webinars, meetings, reports, you name it. So the website, in addition to the toolkit, our website really houses all of that institutional knowledge. So I would encourage you to take advantage of that website as well. Next slide. The idea here is, as I said, everything we've done over the last 5 years is available here. But the other point I'd like to make is that we're always learning. We're learning today, we learned yesterday, we're going to learn tomorrow from you. And so this is a continually growing body of knowledge. And you know, the idea is just to kind of institutionalize everything we've learned in these couple of places so that you can access it as needed. Okay, next slide. What I wanted to do for a couple of minutes is just talk a little bit about what we call the foundations of this program. And you know, the first thing I wanted to do was talk about a survey that was done by BJS, Bureau of Justice Statistics, back in 2016. Next slide. You know, we have known that interest in this technology has been around for a while. It's kind of a slow burning interest, and then things kind of really exploded in 2014 and 15. But we really had no idea how widespread the adoption of this technology was in the United States. And that is until BJS in 2016 included an addendum to their Lima survey. And the Lima survey they do every couple of years, gathers a wide range of information on law enforcement in the United States. And what they did in 16 is they added an addendum that asked questions about body-worn cameras. It took a couple of years for it to be published. It was published in 2018, but when it was published, it gave us the first definitive snapshot of how widespread the adoption of this technology is in the US. And what those results showed was that by 2016, nearly half of the law enforcement agencies in the United States had adopted at least some body-worn cameras. And also it showed that large agencies, the percentage was even higher, about 80%. And keep in mind, this was in 2016. So where are we in 2020? I would suspect we're quite a bit higher than that. There's a link there to the full report that provides a wide range of information that was collected as part of the survey. There were two interesting pieces of information that we've included here. The first on the left is for agencies that said, yes, we have body-worn cameras. They were asked why. What were the reasons that they were acquired? And you can see some of the most common reasons for adopting body-worn cameras, which may be very consistent with your agency and why you adopted, from officer safety to reducing complaints, liability, things like that. So lots of reasonable reasons for adopting the technology. What I think was really interesting on the other side of the slide, for an agency that responded, nope, we haven't adopted body-worn cameras, the survey then asked why haven't you done it yet? And what you'll see on the right is a whole lot of the C word being cost. Storage, hardware, maintenance, public records requests. So the main concern among those agencies that had not adopted was cost. Like I said, this really gave us the first definitive snapshot of how widespread it was. And keep in mind, this was in 2016, and things I'm sure have, percentage I'm sure is quite a bit higher. The other thing I wanted to do is talk a little bit about research. So in addition to the technology diffusing rapidly in the United States, research has grown rapidly as well. Back when I got involved in body-worn cameras in late 2013, I wrote a report for the Department of Justice on kind of where things were in late 13, early 2014. And it was an easy job for me because there were only 5 studies that had been completed at the time. By 2019, there were more than 70. So the research has grown very, very quickly. And what's been frustrating, I think, for a lot of police leaders, police officers, is not only how quickly the research has been coming out, but how inconsistent or contradictory it seems at times. You'll have one study come out that says body-worn cameras produce tremendous declines in use of force and complaints. And then the next week, another study comes out, different police department, and says the exact opposite thing. So what I wanted to do today was just to hone in on a couple of areas where I think the research is most consistent and talk about those issues. And then we have a session on some of the research with regard to use of force and complaints and changing behavior coming up later this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. So you can tune in for that. So I wanted to focus in on 4 areas where things are pretty consistent. So next slide. The first area that I wanted to focus on is what police officers think of body-worn cameras. There have been about 30 studies that have asked officers in departments across the country what they think about body-worn cameras. Some of these studies ask before officers wear cameras, some ask after. I think the best studies do both. They talk to officers both before and after. And I'll explain this slide in a minute, but in general, what the research has shown is that police officers are very supportive of body-worn cameras. The research does show that in some departments, officers have some concerns. They have some reluctance, some areas that they worry about a little bit. But generally, what we've seen is when officers start wearing cameras, those concerns disappear. So let me explain this slide. So this is from a study I did with the Tempe, Arizona Police Department. I did surveys of officers multiple points in time before and after they started wearing cameras. So if you look along the bottom of the slide, you can see the first time I did a survey of officers was in June of 2015, and then the last was October of 16. You'll notice there are two lines. Because the study with Tempe was a randomized controlled trial, so there were two groups of officers. The phase 1 officers got their cameras first in November of 2015, and then the second phase got it about 6 months later. So what you're seeing on this slide is the percentage of officers that agree with one statement. Body-worn cameras are well received by coworkers. So back in June, the first time we did this survey, you can see only about 39% of officers agreed with that statement. Body-worn cameras are well received by coworkers. So what you see there is there was a fair amount of concern among officers in the Tempe Police Department. We did it again in September, and you can see a slight bump up, but then there's a huge bump, particularly among phase 1 officers in December. And that's because they had gotten their cameras the month before. So by the time we got to October of 16, you can see that nearly 90% of the officers were saying that, yeah, I think my coworkers are going to be okay with it. So I use this slide to illustrate how officer perceptions can change fairly significantly over time, particularly after they start wearing the camera. So that's finding number 1. Generally, lots of support among officers. Next slide, please. The next finding I wanted to highlight, where we see a lot of consistency, involves what citizens think. What do citizens think about police body-worn cameras? And there have been about a dozen or so studies that have looked at that, have asked citizens, and generally lots of support. So what you see here is a slide from a colleague of mine from UNLV, Bill Souza, a nationally representative sample. I know it's kind of hard to read, but you see big long lines indicating lots of support for body-worn cameras. Generally, like I said, the studies show citizens are very, very supportive. Now, this study, like a lot of studies, just asks, the general population, what do you think? Now, the issue is that most people don't have normal routine interactions with the police. So one of the kind of subsets of folks I think we want to focus on are people who actually have encounters with police and have those encounters recorded. Next slide. So what I call those folks consumers of police services. This is someone who something bad happened. They called the police responded, the police recorded the incident. Now, what does that person think of police body-worn cameras? The folks who are actually recorded during encounters with police may have very different views, or at least that's what we thought. But the studies that have been done that have focused on individuals who are recorded also show very high levels of support. So for example, we see here some work I did in Spokane, Washington and Tempe. We were calling citizens who had encounters with the police. The encounter was recorded. We were calling them a week or 2 weeks later, and we were asking them about body-worn cameras. And you can see, even among this group of folks who were recorded, very high levels of support. So for example, video cameras should be worn by all officers in the Spokane or Tempe Police Department. In Spokane, 86% agreed or strongly agreed. In Tempe, it was even higher. So the first two findings, pretty high levels of officer support. Second finding, pretty high levels of citizen support. Okay, next slide. The third area where I wanted to focus in on is the one I think that's gotten the most attention, and with good reason. And it has to do with the impact of body-worn cameras on citizen complaints and use of force. And you know, I think most of us remember, or at least have heard, the Rialto study. The findings came out back in 2013, and you can see, you know, on the left portion of this slide, the results were remarkable. From 1 year to the next, after officers starting wearing cameras in that department, huge drops in complaints and use of force. 88% drop in complaints from 1 year to the next. And you can see the numbers, the actual numbers in parentheses. Small police departments have small numbers, but still really remarkable. And then shortly after the Rialto study, a couple other studies also showed very large declines, not quite as large as Rialto, but Mesa and Orlando. And then I remember I was at IACP in October of 2017. I believe it was in Philadelphia, and the researchers from the DC Metro study produced their results at IACP, and no impact on complaints, no impact on use of force. And I remember people were in a tizzy about this. How could that be? What are we doing? How could it be that one study shows such large declines and the next study shows none? And then since then, there have been a number of other studies that have come out. And I think the point here is not to put too much stock in any one study. Take a step back and look at what the body of evidence tells you. And that's what we're doing here when you look at what's red on the slide. So there have been 26 studies that have looked at the impact of body-worn cameras on citizen complaints. 20 of the 26 show reductions, either substantial or statistically significant reductions. 20 of 26. We don't deal with absolutes in social sciences. There are no guarantees, but I'll tell you what, 20 of 26 is pretty darn good, pretty persuasive. The use of force studies, 19 studies have looked at the impact on use of force. 11 of 19 have shown reductions. Again, not unanimous by any means, but I think pretty persuasive. Okay, next slide. The fourth and final area I wanted to highlight real quick is the evidentiary value of body-worn cameras. There are a number of studies that have looked at this, and the evidentiary value can play out in a couple of different ways. Some of the early studies that came out of the UK, for example, linked the presence of footage with increased likelihood of guilty pleas in criminal cases. Several studies have documented the evidentiary value in terms of reviewing and adjudicating complaints against officers. In particular, the Las Vegas study showed the frequency at which officers were exonerated from complaints because of the BWC footage. Phoenix also showed that. And then several studies have honed in on specific types of criminal cases. One good example is domestic violence cases. And a study in Phoenix and a study in the UK both showed the positive impact of footage on the processing of the downstream processing of domestic violence cases. So those are the four areas that I wanted to highlight where we see consistency: the officer level, officer support, citizen support, the impact on complaints and force, and then also the evidentiary value. Next slide. Now, as I said, it can be dizzying at times, the speed at which the research is coming out. So what we wanted to do is create a resource that you could use that would be relatively easy to access and to understand. And we've done that. We call them outcome directories. And you can see the link there. And it's an Excel spreadsheet that shows information on all of the studies that have examined a given topic. So I mentioned there were 19 studies that have looked at use of force. If you go to the directory on use of force, you will see those 19 studies, a summary of some information on each study, and then specifics on the findings. So it gives you a place to go where you can see kind of a quick and dirty look at the research on a given topic. And then it also gives you the option to dig deeper if you like. You can actually access all of the studies through the directory. We've got directories on use of force, complaints, officer activity, and we have one coming out real soon on officer perception. So if you're interested in finding out more about the research, you can look there. But also, I highly recommend in the next session we have a couple of folks, Craig Buchita and Eileen Malm, talking about research as well. Next slide. All right, I want to move quickly through the remainder because I think we're running short on time and we want to have a little bit of time for questions. I will say that there are lots of areas where researchers are still focusing. There's areas where we don't have much research at all, and you can see them on this slide. There's a lot of focus. I think on, like I said, some of the downstream outcomes. So how are prosecutors and public defenders and defense attorneys using the footage? What impact does it have on outcomes in court cases? Are you more likely to have guilty outcomes? Does it increase or expedite the adjudication of cases? Does the adjudication happen more quickly? I want to highlight the one on the bottom, cost-benefit analysis. And there's really only been one good cost-benefit analysis that has been completed to date, and CNA did it, and they did it as part of their Las Vegas study. And what they were able to show is, once taking into account all of the costs and all the benefits or the advantages, they were able to demonstrate with an economist doing the work that the body-worn camera program saved that agency about $4 million per year. And the vast majority of that savings was tied to reductions in investigative time for citizen complaints. But one cost-benefit analysis is not good enough. We need more work. And as I said, the research is coming out very, very quickly. And these are some of the areas where you're going to see some studies coming out. Okay, next slide. The last thing I wanted to do for a few minutes is just highlight some information on the policy review process. David talked about this a little bit. We've got a session, or concurrent sessions actually, coming up, one on research and then one on policy, and particularly the scorecard review process. And I will, I'm going to be involved in the policy one. So if you want to hear more about this, please attend the next session. But next slide. As David said, administrative policy is a foundational piece of this grant program. And I'm sure you're aware of that by now. And I'll talk a little bit in the next session about the certification process for agencies that have been at this for a while or perhaps have been funded already. But for those that are just getting started, we've developed and honed this policy review process over a period of several years. And essentially, it's a collaborative process where you work with your TTA lead to make sure that your policy is comprehensive, that it covers all the bases that you need to cover. And this, as I said, it's a collaborative process. It's not adversarial. You share your draft policy with your TTA lead. We've got a scorecard that I'll show on the next slide that reviews or assesses the policy across a wide range of issues. You work with your TTA lead if there's some areas that are not quite up to snuff or are deficient. And then you get to the point where the policy's good to go, and then it's submitted to BJA, it's approved, and then you get access to the remainder of your funding. Next slide. This is the scorecard. I'll talk more about this in the next session, but it's not fancy. It's an Excel spreadsheet, and there are 9 different areas of policy covering 36 specific issues. Can you still hear me okay? I'm getting a message that says my audio is not working.
We can hear you, but it's a little bit garbled.
Okay, I'm not sure what to do about that.
I think it's fine if you just keep going. It kind of clears out a little bit. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So anyway, the scorecard, as I said, 9 areas, 36 specific issues. What you're seeing here on the slide is the policy development area. It's publicly available, so if you want to take a look at the scorecard, you've probably seen it already, though, if you've been working with your TTA lead on your policy. There are 13 issues in red. Those are the issues that are deemed by BJA of such importance they absolutely have to be covered in your policy. And I think the really important point to keep in mind here is that the scorecard, the process is only designed to look at the comprehensiveness of your policy. It's not prescriptive, it's not directional, and by that, what I mean is that BJA, CNA, we're not telling you what to say, in your policy. We're just saying that you need language in there that gives your officers guidance. And the example I like to use is citizen notification. So for example, citizen notification is a red item on the scorecard. It's a mandatory item. But what the scorecard item says is simply, does your policy provide guidance to your officers on citizen notification? Yes or no? You determine what the guidance is. You may tell your officers that citizen notification is mandatory. You may say it's recommended. You may say, you know what, you're not required to notify. All of those very different responses to this issue are good to go. They would get a yes on a scorecard. So that's what I mean by saying it's not prescriptive. You determine at the local level what you want the specifics to be in terms of the language. We're only helping you make sure that the comprehensiveness of the policy, that all the relevant issues are in fact addressed. Okay, next slide. These are the 9 issues or the 9 areas of policy that I mentioned. And it's pretty straightforward. You know, our goal here is basically to make sure that you have a good policy. And we believe that a good body-worn camera policy will lead to good body-worn camera practice. And if you want to hear more about why we think that is, you know, tune into the next session where we talk more about this policy process. Next slide. The one thing I will give a slight plug for is because the scorecard process is not prescriptive, we see a lot of variation in how agencies handle specific policy issues. So for example, citizen notification, what are agencies saying? What we've done every year is we've done a policy analysis where we go in and we look at some key policy issues and we just identify trends. What are agencies saying on a given topic? And I'll talk more about this in the next session as well. But the idea is just to provide a document for grantees and others to look at to get a sense of what the key trends are. Next slide. And just to whet your appetite a little bit, these are the 10 areas that we focus in on. You can see citizen notification is one of them. But as I said, we look at the latest issue of the policy analysis. We looked at over 300 policies and examined them across these different issues. So I believe that's it for me. And I believe we also have some time for questions. And I think there was one question. Yep, there's our contact information. All right. I know for the first question that came in had to do with training, and there are a couple of things I could say about that, and maybe David has some thoughts as well. I know there is a session later today. Dan Zenders has a session on training, so certainly take a look at that. We have done a few webinars and reports specifically on body-worn camera training. So if you go to the TTA website, there's actually a training link. You can click on that and see some of the resources that are available. Okay, other questions?
I did see a question on there, Mike, about from an individual about the one-to-one match. The individual mentioned about they have the one-to-one match. They use an example of 54K. That at 27K, that would be half of that. That can be used for body-worn camera, for the purchase of the body-worn cameras. They talked about training and travel. That you can actually put that either under the federal award amount that you receive, or you can do it as your match. You just have to make sure that it's documented properly in your file, that this is how my match is being broke up, or this is something that I'm using as part of the federal funds. So it's all about documentation.
I did see one question about the impact of body-worn cameras on the number of officers who are assaulted. I didn't mention that because it's an outcome that has not been examined very frequently. I know there was one study that came out a while back, I think it was in 2016, that showed an increase in assaults on officers after they began wearing cameras. That is the only study that I know of that has documented that. I know in the work that I've done in a couple of different places, found no impact at all. And I know some other studies. I think the issue with one of the difficulties in looking at that outcome is how rare it is. I know in the work that I did in Spokane and in Tempe, it just does not happen very often. Like I said, I haven't seen really, other than that one study, which is kind of an outlier, I haven't seen anything come out that showed that there was an increase. And I think the few other studies that have been done have found really no impact at all, because it's just an event that doesn't happen, thankfully, very often.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Thank you, David Lewis, for your great presentation on the body-worn camera policy and implementation program. And I'm sure many folks will stay tuned for that small and rural grant opportunity you noted. And thank you, Dr. White, for your overview of many of the topics that we'll be kind of delving into later in the sessions and later in this conference, as you noted. Really appreciate that. And I think it gives us all a good background and base to start as we listen to these other sessions.